How can EMFs impact brain health and cause a change in the mood of your entire family? You're listening to the 2025 EMF Hazard Summit. My name is Nick, the EMF Guy Pinot, and this is the EMF Hazard Summit, Protect Your Children. In this presentation, cognitive science researcher Dr. Julie McCredden reveals the shocking reality that the amount of EMFs emitted by everyday gadgets, like your cell phone, for example, has been shown to cause brain damage and changes in mood in your kids. Dr. Julie McCredden is a cognitive science researcher, educational designer, and counselor. She is currently president of the Oceania Radiofrequency Advisory Association, also called ORSA. This not-for-profit organization collates and disseminates the science of EMFs focused on human planetary health via an online database. I'm here today with Dr. Julie McCredden. Dr. McCredden, thanks so much for being on EMF Hazards.
You're welcome, Nick. It's nice to have an opportunity to talk to the people who follow you.
So I did mention your bio a few seconds ago, but at the same time, I want to put this into context. This is not, this is something you've been looking at, this topic of the electromagnetic fields emitted by technologies and then their potential health risks. What is your scientific background and how long have you been looking at the scientific literature on this topic?
Well, my actual background is in cognitive psychology and perception. So perception is all about, well, in particular, it was visual perception, but perception is all about how the senses take in the world. And then cognition is how we make sense of that and remember it and make decisions, and act upon the world. So my PhD actual background was actually in neural networks, which are now, they're artificial neural networks, which are now used as the basis of AI systems. Though in those days we weren't using it for that reason, we were using it to try and understand how the brain works. And then I went into applied, I worked in that for many, many years and children's development as well, in laboratory type experiments but also in teaching a little bit. And then I went into applied, which is just trying to help in education, help with children and teenagers learning difficult concepts. And discovered that what was going on in education was there was a lot of hype. And what I was observing with the young people in university, it wasn't meeting the hype. And they were starting to get this like cut and paste mentality, even in high school too, and a lot of distraction from multiple sources of information coming in at once. And losing something was going on with losing the ability to concentrate and focus, which you need, the sequential focus reasoning. So I started looking into this and, at first I was a great believer. I was giving out technology and trying to promote it at university thing. I was bamboozled by the hype for a while and I thought it's not meeting expectations and something's going wrong. And through that, I discovered that there's a problem, that there's a really big problem. And it's not just about, social media and addictions, which are a whole topic in themselves. And I guess I'll start my slide presentation with that. What happened was about 10 years ago, a few of us formed an organisation, which is ORSA. And what we decided to do was to collate the science, use our scientific background and research backgrounds and skills to try and collate and make sense of the scientific evidence on this topic, because the debate is actually happening around the science and yet it's not being communicated to the public, and we ourselves didn't know either. So one of our members is an ex-radiation protection officer and researcher from the Australian Radiation Protection Organisation, as it formerly was. and said, let's put together a database. So we did that, and we've now got over 4,000 papers in that, particularly focusing on EMFs and health. That's electromagnetic fields and health. And then we've categorized all the papers into various topics, and it's free and online, and people around the world are using it. And here I've got an example of how we've used it to actually show a report of all of the different biological and health effects. Experiments have looked at the effects of phones or tablets as well, but mostly mobile phones. And these are the types of reports that you can get out of the database. And you can see from there that, there's a range of effects. And in particular, I'm just pointing out oxidative stress and DNA damage and cardiovascular, because they're really big ticket items. And oxidative stress is what underlies most chronic health diseases these days. And you can see there's quite a few papers on that topic. So, and of course, neurotransmitters, which is what I'm going to focus on today. So really, the focus for me is our children and youth. What's wrong with what's happening in the world today. And, if I asked you, Nick, you'd probably know all about blue light and addiction and posture and lack of sunshine and fresh air and, children living in fantasy worlds and passive learning. And a lot of parents are concerned about these things. But in particular, also, there's the exposure. This is what people aren't aware of, even people who care about all of these other things. They're not aware of the constant exposure to microwave radiation that's coming from that screen. And and going into the child's brain and into their gut, their thyroid, constantly for hours and hours a day. I like to remind people that we are electromagnetic beings, and we live in an electromagnetic world where there's this constant flow of positive and negative charge from the trees to the animals, the heads, the lightning, creating the Schumann resonance in the background, which is needed for life. Very subtle, constant movements. And when we put man-made signals into this, we're interfering with the natural ones. And if you look at what's going on in people's homes, this is the type of exposures that people have to EMFs. I'm saying EMFs because that includes low frequency as well as high frequency radiation. Low frequency means it's slow. The waves are long and slow. And that's anything that has wiring in your house, like your TV, and they can get away from them by distance. But the radio frequency, which is the higher frequencies coming, that send the communication signals from phones and modems and laptops, that travels a lot further, and you can't get away from it. It's coming from the mobile masts outside your house and up the street. And children are exposed to this for 5 hours a day at school, as well as when they go home and in their beds as well. So there's a lot of exposure going on. So an example of looking into children's exposures is people are starting to use modelling now, which is better than the way it used to be. They always used to look at SAR, the specific absorption rate, which is just the energy going into the brain. And it was estimated, whereas now there's computer modelling for it, which is good. And children have smaller head. They have greater absorbent laptop in front of them. You can see the stronger, the brighter yellow in this diagram is the higher exposure. So you can see it's all going to the front of their head. And when it's on the side, it's going in through their brain and sweeping across their head. And they have 30 times more radiation going into the hippocampus than adults, 10 times more into the skull, and 2 to 5 times more into their eyes. So pregnancy and childhood and teenagerhood, they're critical times for development, and all of this radiation now is affecting the development of their neurons and their brain function. Now, just reminding people, they may not know that signals, they talk about, the waves as being short and fast for mobile phones, not these long ones for radio, but much shorter and faster. And also they're sent in pulses for various techniques. It's sent and it's sent and it's sent, and there's tiny little gaps along the way. And when you look at the frequency and the the timing of those gaps, they actually create pulses that correspond to brain waves. So you can see there's tiny little pulses at 217 hertz, which are like our gamma waves. And you can see here, gamma is deep focus, right? And then there's ones that are around our alpha waves and ones that are around our delta waves. So that's what's happening when you put the phone to your head, or when a child puts a phone to their head. And this is a series of studies done in the late 1990s and early 2000s by the Salford group. And I've put a summary of different experiments here onto the one slide, but you can see what they do is they put rats into these little boxes, and they can run around, but they're about the age of human teenagers, and they expose them to very weak exposures, much lower than the official limit. And then they look at the effects on their brain. They sacrifice the rats and they look at the effect on their brains immediately and then later on. And this shows that the effects on the frontal lobe, that there's pathological leakage around small left vessels, that there's in the long term, there's albumin leakage. Now, albumin leakage in the brain creates neurodegeneration. They're the normals and they're the exposed. So you can see all of this albumin leakage happening. And then in the pyramidal cells in the hippocampus, which is, I'll talk about more later, there's damage. And in the cortex, there's damage where you see shrunken nerve cells and dark neurons. And the Salford basically, he concluded that after some decades of use, a whole generation of users, that's our current teenagers turning into middle-agehood, perhaps even in middle age. And that's happening. We're seeing early onset dementia from direct neuronal damage and blood-brain damage. Now, blood-brain barrier damage. Now, you've probably heard about the blood-brain barrier before, but it's basically a barrier between the blood supply and the neurons themselves. And the barrier is actually created by cells, but also by other neurons. And when that breaks down, it actually allows toxins into the brain, like heavy metals. And so the effects of these radio frequencies that are opening up the blood-brain barrier are actually allowing toxins, chemical toxins and metal toxins into the brain, and it's synergistic. And it's not just 1 + 1 = 2, it's 1 + 1 = 200. And my particular focus is on the hippocampus because it's a very, very important part of the brain. It's in the midbrain, and which is where emotional processing happens. But the hippocampus is used for cognitive processing as well. So it's used for short-term memory to long-term memory transfer. So when you study something and go to sleep, the hippocampus sends it to long-term memory and spatial memory in particular, which happened. And that tags the memory and helps you to retrieve it later on. And in the hippocampus are these pyramidal neurons that we were talking about before. And if you have damage to the hippocampus, then you're going to have damage to your spatial ability, your ability to make long-term memories. And it's been implicated in Alzheimer's, depression, bipolar disorder, and memory problems. So damage to the hippocampus in particular has been shown in many rat studies. And this one, I'm just giving you an example. So what they do is they pop the rats into this maze called the Morris Water Maze, and they basically have to swim around and find a platform because rats don't like water. So they train the rats to do this. And what they do is, while they're training, they might, during the night when they're in their cages, or sometimes their cages during the day, they'll expose them to microwave radiation, from phone type signals. And in this particular experiment, they did that for only 6 minutes a day for up to 6 months. And what they found was that the rats who were exposed compared to the control rats, that they had damage to their hippocampus cells. They were reduced in numbers, irregularly arranged, and the mitochondria in particular were swollen and disordered. And you can see here, this is a nice healthy mitochondria, and this one is all swollen and hemorrhaged. And that's from the exposed rats, and these are the control rats. And the changes in the structure and function in the brain were were shown afterwards, but they correlated with the changes in the rats' behaviours, in their inability to remember where the platform was. And there's been many experiments where they do similar types of studies. They get them to try and remember. They put them in different places, but they also all show similar things. And these are at very low levels of exposure. And you can extrapolate from animals, from rat studies to humans, because rat studies are used for a lot of understanding of how the human brain works. So an example of that is adolescent spatial memory. In this study, young people, grade 7 to 9, they had exposure meters put on their bodies to actually measure how much exposure they were getting during the day. And that happened for 3 days. And they also gave students a figure or memory task. So here you can see they give them pairs of figures like this. And they have to remember that pair. And then later on, they show them this figure and they have to select the correct one, which would be this one, from a whole list. So it's a recognition memory task. And what they found is the more exposures that young people had, the less able they were able to do this task. So it's correlating, once again, spatial memory deficit with greater exposures. And there's been many, many studies on changes in neurotransmitters. Now, there's a whole lot of changes in the brain. There's changes to the way that, so if this is a bunch of neurons here and this is a bunch of neurons here. What happens is for these neurons to send messages through the brain, they send neurotransmitters across the synaptic gap. And then they go to the next lot of neurotransmitters, and then that goes on through the brain, and that's how signals are sent through the brain. And so there's a whole lot of different ways that you can change these. You can change the presynaptic signaling, increase or decrease, post, or change what neurotransmitters go across those gaps. And the main neurotransmitters that people have probably heard of, they've probably heard of GABA, dopamine, serotonin, and maybe acetylcholine. And changes from EMF exposures have been found in all of these. And you can see what we've got listed here are the effects of those changes. So, for example, if you change GABA, you're more likely to have tinnitus, blurred vision, chest discomfort, irritability, and oversensitivity. If you change dopamine, you're more likely to get depression and learning disorders, etc. And so you can see here what's in orange actually are the symptoms of these changes in neurotransmitters from exposures that are also symptoms of what's called electrohypersensitivity syndrome. So that's people who suffer from various symptoms when they're exposed to EMFs and microwave and communication signals. So there's quite a few of them, as you can see there. And in particular, the ones that really concern me are the sleep problems, depression, anxiety, and ADHD. They're very serious problems. When you say to people, I have a sleep problem, if you know anyone who has a sleep problem and they are increasing, it's a huge problem in a person's life. It's not just a small inconvenience. Yeah. It's a whole quality of life thing that's going on. And there's also damage to the myelin sheath thing, and that's the protective coating that goes around your neurons and dictates how fast the signals get sent. And once again, that's been shown in animal studies. So you can see here that's what it should look like in a healthy myelin-coated neuron in the brain. And this is what happens when it disintegrates. The result is neurodegeneration. So if we look at the, for example, just papers from the AUSA database, our database is called ODEB, AUSA database of electromagnetic bioeffects. So you can see papers that have effects and papers that have no effects, because there's always papers that show no effects and papers that show effects in science. But you can see that the balance of evidence here, which is the orange, is that there's effects in depression, neurotransmitters, anxiety, memory, and in the hippocampus. And I've just got an overview here, because I haven't got time to go into all detail, of the different papers and the different effects to do with young people and children. So if we look at sleep and well-being, there's effects on headache and migraine, fatigue, sleep and sleep disturbances. And over here you can see this is a number of people in those studies and the ages of the children. You can see it's not a small number. These studies have actually looked at very large populations and found significant effects. And when you say headache and migraine, once again, it can be a debilitating condition for people. There's mood and mental health and behavioural problems. Very large studies once again. And young mice, for example, exposed prenatally then have shown problems with ADHD when they're in their teenage years and in adulthood. So, and that's once again due to changes in this presynaptic signaling. And it seems that within ADHD, it looks like what's happening is you're getting a change in glutamine, and due to changes in this presynaptic signaling, and you get decreases in signaling, which correlate with decreases in memory function, and increases in ADHD type behaviours. And the similar study was then followed up with with young boys who showed similar results as the mice who lived closer to radio frequency transmitters. And cognitive function, it's less clear what the effects are of cognitive function. There are effects, though, that have been shown. And in reaction time, in perception, audio and visual perception, memory, spatial memory, and in changes in EEG, that's brainwaves. And I won't go into the details, but you can see once again, there's been quite a few studies. Beautiful study, not beautiful for the children. We're living in front of a pulsed radar, in a village, in front of a pulsed radar tower in Scrunda. You can see there during the Cold War. And the children, and they compared children living in front of the pulsed radar compared to children living next to it, compared to children living in another village. And there was no pollution. It's a farming area. There's just no other factors that really could have caused the changes that they saw in the cognitive function in children. And also in the same journal, in the same place, they also showed effects on cows and trees. But you can see just the differences. So you can see in reaction time, if it's higher, it means it's worse. So these are the exposed and these are the unexposed, and you can actually see it's worse in the females here. That means they're slowed down for the exposed group. And similar exposed group, you can see there's a huge deficit there. The unexposed group, a bit more ability, and the completely in the children in the other village, much greater ability. Now, capacity of working memory is such a core part of cognition, because it's where we put working memories, where we put ideas together to combine them to create new ideas or to reason our way through something. And if you've got a diminished capacity, you really have a diminished capacity to think and to problem solve. And overall, this is a report that came out in 2019, but you can see, if I asked you at what age do you think the health decline is happening in this generation, what would you say, Nick? What would you expect it to be, the health decline to be? What age would you expect to be happening?
Geez, I wish that health decline would would start around your 60s or something like that. I mean,
that's right.
I wish for it to be that way. I know that in young people, it's much different these days.
That's right. And so you can see this report from the US, the decline is starting at age 27, with 20 to 30% increases in major depression, type 2 diabetes, behavioural health problem, and more for women. Now, that increased post-COVID, but that's for other reasons. And I just have a photo there of the type of thing that was happening to young people during COVID. They were masked, not breathing oxygen properly, socially isolated, and on their phones all the time to connect the world and their devices. And that's really an unspoken factor. So in all of the chronic conditions, as I said before, there's this thing called oxidative stress. So what happens is when you get inappropriate signaling between neurons and cells in the body, because of these exposures, the electromagnetic fields are creating this inappropriate signaling. That's toxic to the cell, and it also creates in the wrong proteins being made. It results in proteins unfolding and changing shape. And this has effects for fight those negative effects. And that in short, because you're being exposed 24/7, because you've got your phone in your pocket all the time and your phone against your head and you've got your modem on, then that inflammation builds up and turns into chronic conditions, which are now known to be all based on this oxidative stress. And you can see everything from asthma through to obesity. This is the elephant in the room in all of these. And in particular, the one that's really increasing, that's been shown to be affected by inflammation, is autism spectrum conditions. And Martha Herbert, which I think you might have interviewed Martha Herbert.
She will be one of the other speakers.
Oh, okay. So she'll talk on this extensively, but basically she went looking for, what are the genes and things, but they get switched on by these environmental toxins. And one of those environmental toxins is electromagnetic fields. And if you clean those up, you can actually help reduce the symptoms of autism, but she'll talk about that. So this is what I'm asking people, with an underregulated industry, this is our future. If we have all of these devices, on our bodies, on our phones, on our heads, in our clothing, even in baby nappies, this is what, it's all in the name of convenience and all in the name of communication. But what is the price of this? Is that we are basically destroying the neurons in our brain, changing our neurotransmitters, changing our ability to think, changing our children's behaviour, changing mood, increasing depression and anxiety. What future do we have? What would the next generation look like with all of these effects going on? So I have a lot of tips for keeping you and your children safe. The main one is really just to try and reduce exposure. So that means keep your phone on airplane mode. And keep airplane mode on, location services off, Bluetooth off, Wi-Fi off when you're not using it. Then breakfast, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, you can turn your airplane mode off. So that means you pretend you've come off the airplane, you can talk, you can send messages, and then put it back on again. Otherwise, every 30 seconds to 2 minutes, it's actually radiating your body and your brain and your children. Mm-hmm. And it's worse when you're in a car. It's worse when you're in a Faraday cage because the signal has to be so much stronger. So the advice is don't let children use wireless devices. We've actually got moves across the world now to take smart devices to take phones out of schools, to stop distraction and to stop addiction. But it's the signals that are actually affecting their brain. It's not just turning it off. By the way, turning it off doesn't fix it. You've already told people all of this. So you've told people a whole lot of this, and I know you've got a document on it, so I won't go into it. But the main thing is to really try and one step at a time clean things up in your house. Look at your wiring, and don't think that gizmos that you hang around your neck or that stick on your phone are going to protect you. They may introduce healthy waves, but they aren't going to shield you from the negative ones. And we're talking about, this is not like sugar in your tea. This is constant 24-hour exposures of complex signals that spike and affect neurons and cells constantly. It's basically eroding the building blocks of who we are. And you don't hear about it because this science doesn't want to, well, the mainstream doesn't want this science to get out because there's millions of dollars being made by this technology. In particular, don't put your mobile phone near bed. You don't need it, and your children don't need it. Just get a clock. I've got an old-fashioned clock. Here it is. An old-fashioned clock with a dial, or a digital clock with a battery, and use that. You don't need your phone as your clock. And there are several books for parents to help them. It's behavioral as well, teaching children that they're more important than the phone, not, using the phone as a toy or an entertainment device. Victoria Dunkley has a program on basically disconnecting and resetting your child's brain by getting them away from screens. EMR Australia has a great book on how to set up your home so it's safe. And so does Nicole Bilsma, who's a building biology, has a book on protecting your home against a whole lot of environmental toxins. I've got some science here if people want to see the science. We'll say, well, how can a metal phone like this actually affect my neurons? Well, what's happening is the signals are what we call polarized. So that means sunlight's a lot stronger than mobile phone signals, but sunlight comes in all directions. It goes in all directions and it's random. But these signals coming from the towers and from your phone, all of the positives and negatives are moving at exactly the same time in sync. Right, so the electric field is moving, and all the photons are going up and down at the same time, which is moving the positive and negative charges in your body in sync all the time. And most of those charges that are going to be affected are the ones hanging around the edges of cells, which go in and out of cells to create the signal in between cells and neurons. And in particular, Martin Paul and Panagopoulos have shown that there's voltage-gated gates. They're protein gates in the membranes of cells, and they open and close, and to let ions in and out, which create the signaling. Now, these fields, because they're polarized, create vibrations in these and trick the gates into opening, and so that you get signaling where you shouldn't get signaling. And inappropriate calcium signaling is one of the main kind of causes of so many downstream effects, even including to autism spectrum disorder. And we're pretty sure, well, there's a lot of evidence anyway, that these fields are affecting the calcium-gated channels. And they're also changing the way that molecules connect with one another in structures. Now, that happens in water, and it also happens in proteins. And this is an example of how it's actually happening in the vitamin D receptor. Now, a lot of people in this audience are probably taking vitamin D because they realize they need it. When you're using your phone and all of your devices, you're actually changing the structure of your vitamin D receptor. So it can't uptake vitamin D. And so those supplements are going to be less effective because of the exposures that we're all having. And there's also been DNA damage, which is underlying cancer. Now, this just shows, this is sham cells that aren't exposed. These are cells that are exposed to radiation. That's, the type of nuclear radiation, that in X-rays. And these are cells exposed to radiation from mobile phones. And you can see the tail shows how much damage, that's DNA fragments. And you can see there's a similar amount of fragmentation going on in mobile phone exposures as there is in this called ionizing radiation. And you'll hear scientists, like popular scientists, come out on the radio and TV and say, oh, mobile phone radiation is not ionizing, so therefore it can't cause damage. Well, you can see here it can cause damage. This study came out in the early 2000s. It was a 12-institution study, cost millions of dollars. And yet, when it came out, an industry-linked researcher smeared these researchers, squashed their results, spent a decade working against them so that you, the normal person in the public, didn't hear this. It was squashed in the media. It was downplayed. They discredited the researchers. Now, recently, it took 10 years, but over 10 years, but their names have been cleared in court. Even the university had to apologize to them. All of the results have been shown to be valid. But because of this industry-linked researcher, these results were squashed. And you should have known about it because DNA damage is the basis of so many, effects in the body, including cancer. And the general public should have been told. But instead, it was squashed. So EMF is the elephant in the room for many, many conditions, many health conditions, but in particular, those to do with thinking and reasoning, mood, sleep, behavior. These are not as bad as cancer, and yet they affect quality of life and the ability of people to be functioning adults in society, as well as to have healthy relationships. And all of these are being eroded. People know a lot more about psychology these days than they did when I was young, so they understand that they're stressed because of work, or that they understand they're stressed because of, concerns about rent and cost of living. And they attribute their anxiety to these things, or even to social media feedback, but they don't understand that the pure raw signals are basically destroying the building blocks. So I think I'll stop there, Nick. And have you got any questions? I'll stop my share.
No, well, no questions on my end. A lot of this information I knew, but still listening to it all in one seating, it is a lot. I know it's a lot to take in. My conclusion is simply we owe it to ourselves and to our kids to take precautionary measures right now. This technology is unsafe. It's having impacts. The more you're exposed, the more impact it has. So thank you so much for this very sobering review of the scientific literature. And you also gave great tips there. We're going to also share your slides, if you're willing, underneath the video, so that way people can go back to these action steps. Because, of course, the goal is not to just leave you, fearful of the waves, but of course, have you take action and do your best to minimize exposure. So thank you again for your presence, Dr. McCredden. It was really eye-opening.
You're welcome, Nick. Bye-bye then.
Bye-bye. I really hope that you liked this presentation. If you want to take action on what you just heard, you'll find links to everything that was mentioned by our guest speaker right underneath this interview. If you love the summit and want to own the recordings in audio, video, and written form for all of these 2025 interviews, make sure to click the buttons on this page to get the 2025 EMF Pack. This EMF Pack is heavily discounted during the summit launch and for a very limited time. Remember that every purchase supports my work as an independent citizen journalist, as well as the nonprofit partners that are associated with this summit. Thank you for your attention and support, and I'll see you in the next presentation.